I'll try not to talk over myself. Okay, I'm going to do really short introductions for all of the guest speakers. Not that they aren't all, like Jennifer, incredibly distinguished, not that they don't all, like Jennifer, have incredible resumes and accomplishments, but the main point is to have them here talking to us and giving you a chance to talk to them. When Eli and I began conceiving this course, I think we both agreed that one of the people we most wanted to have visit was Jennifer Atkinson, our colleague from UW Bothell. She has been teaching about eco-anxiety and the emotional impact of climate change, but environmental issues in general for longer than anybody I know, and as well as anybody I know. She's done work both in the US and internationally in this regard. And so I'm really looking forward to finding out where her head is now with regard to this really complicated issue. I'm going to turn it over to you, Jennifer, at this moment. I'll let you know that the screen share is working when you start, and it's all yours.
Great, thank you. And that should have brought my screen to where you can see the slides. Is that correct?
All good.
Great, thanks. So thank you so much for having me here. And I'm also excited to be with this many people, even though I'm joining you virtually.
Oh, finally.
And so I'm hearing a little bit, okay, yeah, so we'll just make sure everybody's muted when they come into Zoom. So thank you for that introduction, Gary and Eli, for letting me join your class. As Gary noted, I teach environmental humanities at the campus up in Bothell. And so in recent years, my research and teaching have really increasingly focused on the emotional and existential aspects of the climate crisis. So what I wanted to do today was say a couple of words about what eco-anxiety is, and how I got into the field, but mostly I really wanted to explore the question of what climate emotions have to do with justice, which is the theme of your seminar and the speaker series. So, whether we use the term climate anxiety, eco-distress, grief about what's being lost, these are all umbrella terms for a range of difficult emotional responses that we have in facing the climate crisis. And for a lot of people, it's what becomes very intense when they begin to really pay attention to climate projections and the severity of its implications and how it affects our security in the present as well as the safety of future generations. But really, anxiety is only one of the emotions that people report. Other responses are grief for what's being lost, or the decision to not have children, or for those who do have children, it might be grief for the diminished world they will inherit. And we've got somebody who just joined on Zoom, if we can have them mute themselves. Hearing a little bit of noise there. Then fear is also very prominent, or feeling overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of climate issues. For many people, it's also primarily anger about the consequences of historical inaction on climate, or rage about climate injustice and how communities that have been the most marginalized and oppressed are precisely the ones that are paying the highest toll and are the first ones that are impacted, particularly Black and Brown communities and those who have been colonized. So that's kind of the what. In terms of how I got into this work, I want to note that I am not a mental health professional or therapist. I come from a background in the humanities and in English specifically, but I've taught environmental studies for the past 14 years. And during that time, I've watched my students just spiral into despair. And on this slide, I have some quotes from the first day of one of my recent classes at UW Bothell when I asked students how they felt about the future. You can see here, I feel hopeless, useless, and minuscule. Why even bother bringing children into an already dying world? Describing their emotional state as a whirlwind of despair, overwhelmed by grief. That one on the bottom of the left column, seeing the planet break down has made me break down. And I bet this resonates with a lot of you, even if you're not in an environmental field, you don't have to be. I mean, we all live in this world and see what's happening. And when we follow the news headlines and scientific reports, we can get pulled into a downward spiral of heartbreak and grief. I mean, it's everywhere you look, right? We just had the deadly floods in Pakistan and the recent hurricanes in Florida and Puerto Rico, a summer of record-setting heat waves across North America and China and Europe and California. Someone once described living in this age of climate breakdown as an experience of broken record breaking, which I think is a really brilliant summary of our moment. So that was the first factor. The second one, though, was my personal experience. I became interested in this topic partly because of direct experience of the wildfires in California, which is where I grew up and still spend quite a bit of time with my family who have been directly impacted. My parents are in their 70s and 80s, and they barely escaped a wildfire that came right up to their front door. This is now 2 summers ago. But even without those more sensational events, I was also just struggling with climate despair in response to the daily stuff, like the latest IPCC report would come out, or I'd see a terrible headline and it would plunge me into a really dark place where I felt like nothing I was doing really mattered because the problem was just so huge. And I share that not because my personal experience is really that important or even unique, but actually for the opposite reason, because it is not unique. There are so many people who feel this way, but talking about dark emotional dimensions is not something that we commonly do in climate discussions. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think in my own case, and it's true for a lot of educators and activists, we often feel like we have to always project optimism or the people around us will lose heart. But then the bigger reason that our society has consistently refused to face the psychological elements of climate breakdown is that we've primarily treated the climate story as a science story. So for the past 30 years, scientists have been the main communicators, and they talk about planetary destruction using statistics, graphs, and numerical equations. And that's not at all to disparage scientists. They're just doing what they do. It's the nature of their discipline. But there are other ways to tell this story. And that's something that I want to circle back to at the end. So those are the twin motivators that led me into this field, my own grief and the despair of my students. And so as a climate educator, I found myself wrestling with a question. The question that I was most concerned with was no longer just what kind of information do students need to succeed in the profession, but what kinds of emotional tools do they need to even finish the degree and then sustain themselves in this work over the decades ahead, where, of course, we can expect many of these problems will become worse and there will be a lot of heartbreak along the way. And so that's just a very different kind of question about my own role as an educator than what I imagined when I first started out. And so as I was wrestling with all of this, in 2017, I saw this story about a group called the Good Grief Network that has a 10-step program for coping with climate despair. And it kind of blew my mind because on the one hand, it seemed like so radical and different as a way to approach the climate crisis. And at the same time, like the most obvious thing you can imagine. Of course, we are experiencing distress from the death of our planet. So why aren't there more resources to help people navigate that? And the work of this group really became the spark that led me to think maybe I could offer something similar as a seminar at UW Bothell to support my own students. So that's just the background. The main question for today's session is, well, what do emotions have to do with climate justice? So I'm going to go through some of these points here. And then you might be able to think of some others as well, or add to the ones that I'm going to present here. So I think that would be kind of an interesting way to sort of see how many connections we can tease out in the conversation at the end. The first one is intergenerational injustice and moral injury to youth. Last year, the largest research study that's ever been done on mental health impacts of climate change for young people showed the profound psychological distress that it's causing. And it is a global phenomenon, not just, tree huggers in Seattle and environmental students at UW. And I'll come back to that last slide. This was published in The Lancet after researchers surveyed over 10,000 teens from across the world. So India, Nigeria, Philippines, Brazil, UK, US, Finland, there were some others, I think. And 56% of youth said that they believe humanity is doomed. 45% of the global respondents said that their feelings about the climate crisis were actually impairing their ability to function. So just to get through the day with normal tasks, like sleeping or concentrating on school or trying to enjoy themselves with their friends. 1 in 4 are afraid to have children, and 77% characterized our climate future as frightening. And the results around, the anger and sadness and anxiety were more pronounced in the most vulnerable countries like Nigeria, Philippines, and India. So the injustice here is that the failure to act on climate is robbing young people of not only their joy, but their well-being. And in fact, some interesting parts of the study showed that the despair of young people has a very high correlation with a sense of being betrayed by governments and lied to by leaders who aren't doing all that can be done and knowingly not doing all that can be done. Many of the respondents said that they actually felt that they could deal with the climate impacts themselves, but what made it unbearable was that the very people who are supposed to be protecting them, right, the adults, are turning away. And so that's where that sense of moral injury comes from, which the authors explicitly use, that undercuts young people's sense of hope in the future. Another thing that's difficult for many young people is that they're often told that they are the hope for the future. But what they say is, how can you older generations put all your hope in us when this is a time-bound problem and we're not even old enough to run for office or make business decisions or often vote? And this is an email from one of my own students that I got earlier this year, kind of summarizing many of these points. She was at home with her family in Malawi when the monsoons came 2 months late. And then they were hit with a cyclone following that, and people in her neighborhood had their houses destroyed and crops were ruined. Everybody, including this student here, was left without water or power. And as she concluded in her email to me, I feel like everything is in the hands of young people, but we are not given the power to actually be able to do anything. Okay, so the emotional harm is a matter of intergenerational inequality. The second bullet point, it's also a matter of racial and economic inequality. So in those responses published in The Lancet, the concern about climate change was concentrated much more heavily in poorer countries and communities of color. The very people who've contributed the least to greenhouse gases that are wrecking our planet. So for example, in the Philippines, you can see here, 92% of youth surveyed said the future was frightening, compared with 68% in the US. And the quote here is from a young person from the Philippines who told researchers she grew up afraid of drowning in her own bedroom. In terms of climate trauma, which is something like more immediate than just the anxiety about potential or future impacts, there's a huge body of mental health research, including a major report from the APA that has linked climate disasters to chronic anxiety and depression, traumatic grief, post-traumatic stress, sleep disorders, substance abuse. And these effects have been shown to develop in anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 of the people impacted. Then the third bullet point here highlights the way emotion and reason are gendered in our discourse about climate. And so I want to unpack, how this has played out both in my own personal experience and more broadly in climate activism. when I launched my seminar on climate anxiety, it was back in 2017, and it was one of the first of its kind on a college campus in the US. And that got it some press that was positive, like at Seattle Times and NBC. At least it started out positive. But then the conservative media caught wind of what I was doing, and the course became a lightning rod, with Fox News running multiple feature stories, just ridiculing this idea of centering emotion as totally frivolous, mocking our students as wimps and babies who couldn't cope with reality. One of their reporters was hounding me with phone calls, and for months showing up on campus trying to get into my classroom. And they made the class into a poster child for snowflake students, using that term very explicitly, and liberal professors crying about polar bears. I don't think I ever mentioned a polar bear in my class, but this is an op-ed that I wrote in response to the wave of harassment that followed. And one of the comments posted by a Fox News viewer that was really typical of the conversation said, do her students curl up in the fetal position with blankies while listening to her lectures? So these are blatantly gendered critiques, characterizing me as the overindulgent mommy with a classroom full of babies. And this also is very common. If you saw the recent film, Don't Look Up, I thought they actually did a pretty good job highlighting this dynamic where the doctoral student, played by Jennifer Lawrence, who discovers the comet in the film, gets dismissed as an unhinged, hysterical woman for making a charged emotional appeal to the public. And that was a characterization that resonated with a lot of female climate scientists and activists who responded to the movie saying, yeah, we're sidelined for not sticking with this passionate data-based modes of climate communication, which incidentally, Leonardo DiCaprio really comically portrayed in the film. Not surprisingly, his mathematical equations and explanations completely failed to resonate with the public. I mentioned this at the beginning, how for the past 30 years or so, the purely scientific rhetoric has not mobilized the public on climate, and yet that's what we still, that's the kind of mode we still prioritize. And there's a lot of interesting research showing how climate activism more generally is feminized as a way to dismiss it. Everything from the right, vilifying Greta Thunberg and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Canada's environment minister was labeled climate Barbie and harassed by male climate deniers. And prominent scientists like Kim Cobb and Catherine Hayhoe have gotten threats of violence, including rape and murder, and dismissed as fake scientists and hags. And I think what's interesting is all of this goes hand in hand with the misogyny inherent in a lot of climate denialism, and these hyper masculine practices we see, like rolling coal. If you're familiar with that, it's the big souped up trucks that have the exhaust pipes that pour black smoke onto cyclists and Priuses. And then one other aside, an interesting article in Scientific American reported on experiments by marketing professors where their respondents were shown to perceive themselves as being more feminine after recounting a sustainable action they'd taken, or they described someone else using a canvas shopping bag as more feminine than a counterpart using a plastic bag, regardless of whether the shopper was male or female. So in terms of our relation to the natural world, I think it's important to think about the implications of this binary gendered thinking around reason versus emotion, where rational discourse is privileged and emotion and subjective approaches are feminized and dismissed. Western scientific and capitalist discourse emerged from the colonial and industrial ages, which privileged a dispassionate male-centric authority and frames the natural world as commodities and resources, also as separate from humanity. So there's this long history of trying to strip any emotional resonance from the way we talk about the natural world in Western science. And we can think of all the value neutral terms that are part of everyday, everyday use, where trees become timber, animals are referred to as livestock, coal and oil, are fuels. It characterizes them as objects, which leads to an apathy towards nature. And so to wrap up this, around the third bullet, I see it actually as very hopeful that we're now reinvesting the climate conversations with an emotional charge and talking about justice and our emotional connection to other beings and obligations towards them, thinking about heart-centered work and talking openly about love and grief for the natural world, because that's why we want to save it, right? Not just because it's a resource that we want to keep consuming. Then a fourth dimension that is on this list arises from the way climate change and colonialism are experienced as an assault on people's identity, with environmental changes disrupting livelihood and subsistence of traditional cultures, especially people whose ways of life are closely tied to the land. Within many indigenous communities, the warming climate is wiping out traditional hunting and cultural practices, whether it's decline of salmon here in Washington state, or communities in Arctic regions that can't travel to ancestral sites or hunt in the old ways because the landscape is melting beneath them. So people in these communities will talk about their ongoing experience of those losses as a form of disenfranchised grief. And that's because the dominant culture doesn't recognize or acknowledge land and animals as kin in the way many indigenous cultures do. And, in the dominant white culture in which I was raised, it's almost like eccentric to grieve for a river or a glacier, right? So for all of these reasons, the current experience of climate injustice is magnifying both past and ongoing traumas for colonized people. I put this article up there by Nyla Burton. I think it's a great piece if you decide to do any follow-up reading. And I also, I have a link to it on the resources page of my website, which I'll share at the end. Most all of the resources I'm including here are available on my website. So I don't want to end on a note of darkness and despair, because that's actually antithetical to all the work that I do in trying to help students build emotional resilience. I don't have time to cover all of these steps for managing climate anxiety. If you are able to take my class in Bothell, you can. If you're a student in Seattle, it's one of the advantages of having 3 campuses in our university. You can take the 20-minute bus ride up. I'll be offering this class in the spring. And my podcast also spends a lot more time on these details. But for right now, I'm just going to highlight 2 of them. The second one is about reframing. And I really encourage my students to see their eco-anxiety as a moral emotion, and reject any framing that suggests that eco-anxiety is a dysfunction or a mental illness. Carolyn Hickman is a really well-known climate psychologist who puts this at the core of all of her work with young people, where she talks about how climate anxiety arises from a sense of compassion and desire for justice. And in my podcast, I focus specifically on reframing grief itself, not just as something that's not bad, but also consider ways that it's actively good. Grief is a way of honoring our connection and our empathy with other species or people. When we feel that pain, we remember that our existence and our well-being are deeply entwined with other lives. And one of my favorite quotes is from Malkia Devich-Cyril, where she wrote, "Joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference. Grief is an evolutionary indicator of love, the kind of great love that guides revolutionaries." So recognizing this is really essential for my students and for other climate activists who've internalized the assumption that grief leads to inaction. And we live in such a grief-phobic culture that the moment you say that word, the image that comes to mind is someone who can't get out of bed or is so immobilized by pain that they're depleted. So going back to that previous slide, that I want to say that the truth is that I think grief is commensurate, or our grief is commensurate with our love. So, insofar as they're two sides of the same coin, embracing and channeling rather than suppressing this response can actually be very powerful as a way of rousing us to action. These are powerful emotions that motivate us to want to fight for what we want to save. And I think, unfortunately, the research on the most effective emotions in climate communication have focused quite a lot on fear. And while it is true that fear and anger might be good at mobilizing action at the outset, we've got to take a longer perspective here and remember that we're going to be doing this work for the rest of our lives. Fear and anger would be great if we could fix this in a month. But those are emotions that lead to burnout. And we have to ask ourselves if that is a sustainable strategy over the long haul of addressing climate injustice over the course of this generation and those to come. And so whenever we're talking about these emotions, I really think that the most important thing is to resist any binary mindsets that split them into mutually exclusive camps, whether it's grief versus love or hope versus despair, because I think that really leads us to overlook the value in these dark emotions. And I also think that binary thinking has contributed really significantly to the rise of climate doomism in recent years, right? We know this label of the climate doomer, somebody who says it's too late and that we're already screwed. A lot of climate scientists and activists are actually arguing that our culture, at least here in the US, that we jumped from denial to doom almost overnight. And that has become the new big obstacle to motivating people. Excuse me. So, for example, climate scientist Jacqueline Gill is in this first quote here commenting on her frustration with the media's focus on apocalyptic outcomes. And likewise, Michael Mann, who's one of the best known climate scientists in the US, has spent well over a decade in these really legendary Twitter battles and media debates where he was debunking climate deniers for the first part of his career. But in his new book, he says now he's redirecting all of that energy to rushing around debunking the doomers who say that it's too late to save ourselves. And so he calls this the new climate war. And for me, this was kind of hard to wrap my head around initially. But the research from psychologists, I think, makes this clearer, the way it's explained, for example, by psychologists like Leslie Davenport, who identify both of these positions as a basic psychic defense against the human discomfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. That we don't like to be in an in-between state where we're unsure what's going to happen. And so while that sometimes leads to disavowal and turning away, other people go towards doom, right? It's already too late. There's nothing we can do now. And Davenport says that paradoxically, moving to either one of these places provides a kind of psychological relief because it gets us out of that gray zone where, we're having to sort of stare into the void and having to sit with uncertainty and ambivalence. And so just to bring this back to my point about grief, doomers do acknowledge and embrace grief, but I think they misunderstand it as an excuse for inaction. They see grief as an end point rather than a doorway, as Margaret Klein Solomon so beautifully put it. And then the other last tip that I will mention is number 3. And this is my closing plug for the humanities here. Humans live their lives by stories. Whether we're trying to make sense of the world or understand ourselves or envision the future, we do all of that through stories. So we need to be aware of the kinds of narratives that we're consuming and circulating ourselves. Most of the information people get about the state of our planet comes from the media, and research shows that 85% of environmental news is told in the negative frame, and it is deliberately designed that way. The news this is not going to be new for any of you to discover, but it is a profit-driven enterprise. and it can't survive without drawing our eyeballs to the screen. And that means that the sensational stories of fires and destruction and hurricanes are going to get more play than the nuanced stories of community change and the long-term behind the scenes work of generating solutions, which, you know, frankly, can be kind of boring. They're slow and it's arduous work. We have to also be aware, of course, that the addictive nature of catastrophic news is intentionally engineered to keep us coming back for more. And brain scans actually show how people get a dopamine hit every time they check back again and again to catch up on the latest update. We have to think of what is the cumulative effect of that. You end up with a perception that you are living in an apocalypse. And you can just think about all the times that you've gotten swept into these doom scrolling loops, like during an election cycle or disaster or any other time when you just can't stop, you know, checking and refreshing. And the moment you step away, there's a physical reaction where you feel vulnerable or like you're compromising your own survival, because we are so hardwired to think that knowing what's going on means that we're safe. This is known as the negativity bias, right? Where even if we see an equal amount of good and bad information, our minds are actually hardwired to pay more attention to the bad stuff. And there's an evolutionary function to that, because in a world of saber-toothed tigers and poisonous snakes, it is actually an advantage to have a brain that's hyper aware of anything that might be a threat. But in today's world, where these images are broadcast from every corner of the world and you see every bad thing happening on screens in front of you, which are with you 24/7, you know, next to your morning coffee, on your pillow at night, our nervous system is not able to tolerate that relentless stress. And it can have chronic psychological effects that wear down our mental health over time. So I want to be clear that I'm not advocating that we sugarcoat reality or indulge in toxic positivity to avoid bad news. But if we want to build resilience, being consciously aware that the media is actively manipulating the negativity bias is a crucial first step. And it's also an opportunity to remember that those catastrophic stories are just one version of reality. There is a whole universe of empowering stories that are happening at the same time as the bad stuff. So every person who's engaged in creating change in every part of the world in countless ways, we see incredible shifts underway in financial markets, schools, social justice movements, energy, agriculture, youth movements. The headlines that I put on this slide are just a handful of screenshots I grabbed at the very end of September, just from that month alone. These solution-based stories are vastly underreported, but they're every bit as real. And if you want somebody to aggregate this for you, I really like Grist the Beacon, which is on the top left. It's a newsletter that sends you a daily dose of good climate news. The Solutions Journalism Network is a consortium that reports on solutions to problems. And it's important, though, that their goal is not to avoid the bad news. They will still tell that part. But what they add in is the piece that's missing from mainstream accounts, which is how are people responding? So their point is not to make us feel good, but to provide a template for interventions that have worked in one context so that we can apply them in others. And just while I'm on this topic, and I know I need to be finishing up here like right away, but I was so excited because just this morning, I'm going to drop this into the chat for anybody who's on Zoom, and maybe we can pull this up on the screen when I'm finished. Just this morning, I got an email from Grist. So we're talking about alternative stories now in the realm of fiction, not in journalism. This is a series called Imagine 2020, or Imagine 2200. It's climate fiction for future ancestors. And writers from around the world tell stories of discovering these intersectional worlds of generational healing and community solutions. Grist summary here, this is from my email, as they write, each story weaves hope, solutions, and justice together to transport our imaginations far into the future and shows us paths forward and through the present climate reality. Solutions range from the magical to the technical to the communal. And you could say, okay, right, but what if we're just, indulging in wishful thinking and soothing ourselves as the world burns down? Is it possible that these hopeful stories are just escapism? And so this is my last point now. Stories do have real implications for the kind of future we're going to create. And our perception that the existing political and economic institutions are inevitable is reinforced when we never see alternative stories. The genre of apocalypse is the dominant one of mainstream news, Hollywood fiction, climate fiction. And so I really love Joanna Macy's framework, where she breaks down the three dominant stories competing to define this moment. And the first one, she says the business of usual story is the one that wants to preserve the status quo. This is where economic growth, technology, and the free market are supposed to lead to prosperity for everyone. The second story here is the story of the Great Unraveling, which predicts collapse, mass extinction, conflict over resources. I mean, this is the one that my students subscribe to. But then the third story is what Macy calls the Great Turning, which sees in our current moment the possibility of profound social transformation towards genuine environmental justice. And Macy says that the point here is not to argue over which of these three stories is correct, since they are all happening. The real question is, which one do we want to invest in? And so she writes in this box at the bottom of the slide, that third story of transition and regeneration is where you will turn when you acknowledge that the first story is leading us to catastrophe, but you refuse to let the second story have the last word. Okay, I'm going to stop. I actually lied. I do have a couple more slides, but I won't go over them. But yeah, this is the question we can leave on the table here is, what story are we going to live in? Is this moment a womb or a tomb? And I have on this closing slide here a bunch of the books and materials that have been really influential in my own research. If you want to check any of those out or follow me on social media, I really don't even use Twitter. Instagram is I can only handle one platform at a time, but I do try to post new articles that come out and workshops and my own talks and podcasts there on my Instagram account. So if you want to follow me, you can get monthly updates on all of that stuff. So yes, I'll go ahead and stop and take some questions, and hopefully also some ideas and thoughts from all of you in terms of, what is this question of climate emotions? What are the links between that and climate justice?
Go ahead and stop screen sharing if you want. So we can
okay.
see you, which is great. Thank you. That was fantastic. Two things I want to highlight, I think, that are really important are the way you really made it clear that emotions are not static and they're not separate, right? The world of our emotions is full of connections, and there are possibilities for transformation there that are really important. You also reminded me that my favorite button on my TV remote is the mute button. You really can use that to regulate what's going in. Okay, I'm going to give first priority to students here to ask questions. So, yes. Keep pressing. No, you can. She'll hear you if you project. Keep it brief, okay? Keep your questions brief.
Okay. Hi. I'm in the very background.
Can you hear her?
I can't. But Gary, maybe I can hear you just fine, Gary. So if you want to repeat it or have the student come up to wherever you're standing.
Coming up front.
Okay. So I have struggled a lot with, I guess, climate anxiety, and I've considered dropping out of school because of it. And I wanted to ask the question if you think it's ignorant to ignore environmental problems in order to kind of be able to get through school and get through my degree.
Yeah, that's a big one. So first, I want to say, I hear you. You're not alone. I have heard other students say they want to drop out. I actually kind of did myself when I was an undergraduate. I mean, I didn't drop out, but I wanted originally to go into environmental studies, and it was so depressing and overwhelming to me that I left and I went into English. And then I kind of came back, I looped back around. But I have kind of thought about this even now in my career, and I hear a lot of activists and other educators talk about how they'll completely kind of compartmentalize. They go on like a media cleanse. They won't check the news. They won't read the recent report because it so sort of disables them from actually doing the work that needs to be done. So what I would say to you is I think your impulse is actually probably along the right path, which is to reduce the sort of doomist input that you're getting so that you can still function. But of course, we can't completely shut off from it, because I feel like it's our responsibility and it's our obligation within this generation to do the work that needs to be done. So while I think in a kind of a short-term scenario, that compartmentalization and sort of just shutting it down, turning away is an okay, that's a basic psychological strategy, right? I've got to study for my midterms right now. I cannot read that, terrible headline. But it's not a responsible or really even feasible strategy in the long run, because I want to tell you, I bet that as much as you will kind of try to avoid the bad news, on a very deep level, it's still there, and you don't even have to read the news. You can go outside and you can feel it. You can feel climate change. It's happening to our bodies. We're breathing it into our lungs when we breathe the smoke here. And so what I think is really important is reframing. It's not to say that we're going to take our grief and we're going to transform it into joy, but we need to learn to live with both of those responses at the same time, and to understand that our grief does not make joy impossible. In fact, it can actually amplify it. And if we think about the way in which the work that needs to be done is not just a burden, but it is an opportunity. It's an obligation. It's a moral calling to be part of this generation that's facing some of the biggest challenges, and that actually has the opportunity to make those changes within our lifetime. I feel that that's a gift. It takes courage, but it also comes with tremendous rewards.
Well, also, if people who are on Zoom want to send questions, Sean can maybe give us one of those at some point. So put those in the chat if you want to. Somebody here have another question?
Yeah, I have one. Are you able to hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. I was wondering, something I've been kind of experiencing lately is not even eco-anxiety, but more of eco-apathy, where I feel detached because I felt all these feelings for so long, and now it feels as if, the problem isn't really impacting me anymore. So I was wondering if you had any advice or things of how to deal with that.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that response. It's another one that's very, very common. Renee Lertzman is a psychologist who did a lot of really interesting research on the affect of apathy itself. And she actually made some really interesting arguments that when she did these in-depth interviews with people who were presenting apathy, that apathy itself is not a sign of not caring. It is another one of our psychological defense mechanisms to deal with something that feels painful. So the first thing I would say to you, and I think this is hopefully a hopeful response, is that the apathy that you are feeling, if you're worried that actually it's a sign that you just don't care anymore, that's actually probably not true. You have just your brain is defending itself so that you can function, and to an extent is also kind of suppressing and compartmentalizing that so that you don't have to feel that pain all the time. And in terms of, so then, what do I do to break out of that apathy? It's a good question that I don't have a fantastic answer towards, because I haven't specifically researched apathy as closely as some other psychologists have. And again, I'm not a psychologist at all. I just kind of know enough to get myself in trouble. But I would look at some of Renee Lertzman's articles, Kari Norgard as well, who wrote a really well-known book in this field called Living in Denial. It might kind of it might help you understand that response a little bit better. But I also think maybe, a strategy that really works across the board here, because whether we're talking about your response being anger, feeling overwhelmed, feeling apathetic, feeling despair, there's no right or wrong response. I mean, people respond differently, but what all of these are signaling is that something is wrong, that you are aware that something is terribly wrong, and that there is an impulse deep down inside then to do something about changing those conditions, right? Again, that's why I say that these are moral emotions. They arise from a sense of empathy and connection with the life that is being put at risk here. And so I think to reconnect, one of the best ways to do that is to reach out and get involved with groups who are having these discussions around difficult climate emotions. And those are listed. Maybe I'll drop this in the Zoom as well. On the resources page of my website, I list groups that specifically meet so that you can have these conversations with other people who are experiencing the same responses as you. Climate cafes, the Climate Courage Workshop, the Good Grief Network that I mentioned at the beginning. And it's one of the things I find so energizing about them is that you're not just meeting other people in your classes, but you're meeting people from around the world. I mean, there are students from Nigeria and from Brazil and from, activists in China who are having these really difficult conversations around climate emotions. And it's just a really fascinating and empowering way to hear other people's voices, but also to have your voice heard. I think that in itself kind of unlocks some of those blockages that you might be feeling where really you've just shut down because you've been so overwhelmed by all of this bad news. But thanks for sharing that. And that in itself takes a lot of courage to do that, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to add something just a little different that seems to me true, which is to both of you actually, it's okay to take time off. You don't need to live with it every moment of every day. And time off is not idle time. A lot of times when you're doing nothing, your brain is processing in really important ways that are going on in your head, right? Get rid of the guilt, whatever you're feeling. That's not very useful. But the other stuff, all of that, yeah. Let me take one more question from here and then see if Sean maybe does one on Zoom. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on how to start talking about these things with yeah.
So the most essential part of your question cut out. You asked how we could start talking about these things, and then I didn't hear the second half.
Family members and communities and just the people around us.
Yes. So there is not communication is complicated. That's what I will say first. There is no one size fits all response to that because like any topic we're talking about, it depends on who you're talking with. And it depends on what your purpose is. Is your purpose to get comfort and support and feel connection? Is your purpose to convince somebody who you feel is disengaged or is a climate denier? And you're going to have a conversation very, very differently based on where that other person is coming from. I think one of the best scholars out there right now who talks about this is Katherine Hayhoe. She has a new book that just came out called Saving Us. And she is a climate scientist in the Bible Belt in a conservative part of Texas. And she speaks about climate change to fundamentalist Christians. And she has had more who are, specifically, self-identified as climate deniers. And she has some really sophisticated strategies around meeting people where they are. And not surprisingly, if you know anything about successful communication, it actually starts not with what you say, but with the listening that you do, right? So if you're trying to reach people, or the other person who has done a lot on this topic is Renee Lertzman. I mentioned her earlier in another context, but she has a whole website right now on motivational interviewing, where you actually are kind of trying to find out what people's values are, where they're coming from in response to the topic, and then finding those points of connection and moving from there, rather than just kind of berating somebody with the facts, which we already know, that doesn't work. But if you're really, if your purpose instead, and again, I probably should have gotten a little bit more information for you before I tried to answer both questions, because you only asked one. But if your purpose is how do I reach out and talk to people about how I'm feeling and about my own climate despair, really, I would suggest that you talk to people who are going to be good listeners and who will be sympathetic and show empathy towards that. So your own peers, or again, other people in those groups like the climate cafes and courage workshops that I talked about. If your family's really averse to it and they think you're a snowflake and a wimp, like the people in Fox News just responding to my class, it's only going to shut you down further. And so that's not a strategy that I would recommend. But I think looking at Catherine Hayhoe's work for how do you communicate with people on other sides of the issue is really, really an effective and powerful set of guidelines for that.
John, do you have a question from Zoom that pops up for you?
Yeah, we got a couple of questions on this.
Can you hear Sean?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Hi, Sean.
I'm listening to you in my ears, so I'm having trouble, I'm getting vertigo. So the question, one question was to Tia asked, and it kind of goes off of what we already started talking about. It's like, if you have friends who are anxious, or you go, you're talking to strangers who are anxious, what sort of quick, are there quick things that we can say to them, that we can, tools we can share with them? Not necessarily about our own anxiety, but helping them with theirs.
Yeah, so I actually, the question cut out a little bit, but I think it was about how do you support friends who are dealing with climate anxiety. So, I mean, not to self-promote at all, but only because it's short, accessible, and easy to get to. My podcast, these are like 15, 20-minute episodes. I've heard from a lot of students and young people, or just other people, actually old people who are feeling climate despair, that listening to those episodes really helped them because it made them feel less alone. They didn't feel like I'm crazy, I'm the only person that's feeling this way. But, some of the strategies I put up on the slides are more like long-term things like taking action, getting engaged. And in the immediate moment, like on a Wednesday night where you just plunge into despair after reading an article, or you talk to somebody who's feeling that way, there are more immediate coping techniques, and they're not actually unique just to climate despair. They work for, any forms of anxiety. I guess one of the ones I put at the top of the list is breathing. Right? Like monitor and slow down your breathing, or remind the person that you're talking with to do that. It's so powerful. I mean, if you could bottle up and sell the benefits of slow breathing, it would be the most commercially successful wonder drug of all time. But you can have those benefits anytime with no special skill, absolutely for free. And there are tons of resources out there to guide you through the process of inhaling and exhaling. People just start with a minute a day, and that actually does have immediate benefits. As Professor Hanwork noted, unplug, take time off. Don't feel like you're abandoning the cause just because you have to sort of, turn away and remember to practice self-care. And then nature as well, like spend time outdoors in green spaces. There's just a mountain of research on the mental health benefits of spending time in nature. The last one I guess I would name off is practicing gratitude and joy. What are you grateful for in your life? What brings you joy? Take an inventory of that daily and make space to have those experiences, whether it's music, friends, napping, things that have nothing to do with climate change whatsoever. I think that's really, really healthy. We need to still be experiencing and practicing joy in our lives, in everyday contexts. Climate work should not be a burden. It should not feel oppressive. It's going to be hard, but if we remember to practice joy and to even use our climate work and studies itself as an opportunity to connect with other people, to integrate arts and music into it, so that we are living joyful lives in the present, then we're actually actively building the world we want to create in the present, rather than delaying and waiting for it to come 20 years down in the future, right? But that's a great question, so thank you.
Jennifer, thank you for spending an hour with us, and in particular for bringing the passion and conviction that you have about everything that you talk about, which I think is really wonderful. I want to just add one short answer to that question too, which Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." If you ever get down, that's one of the world's most wonderful songs, sung so beautifully by him, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Jennifer. One final round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please keep in touch with me again. Feel free, reach out on social media, send me an email. If you can, take my class up at Bothell in the spring. I'd love to meet all of you and continue these conversations. So I hope I get to come back. Thank you also for the organizers for having me.
Jennifer, does your class in Bothell have a remote option for people who can't get there?
Oh, I could work on that. I could see what we can do.
Thank you.
We're going to work on that. Good idea.
The one thing I will say about that is it is a hybrid course. So we only meet once a week, and the other meeting is online, and it's in the evenings as well. It's at 5:45, so that makes it easier for people who have day classes and jobs to come up to it. So yes, it's only really what you're talking about is there would be 8 live meetings, and all of the rest of them would be online during the quarter.